Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on a topic that's about as weighty as they come. We're talking capital punishment in the United States, or, as most people probably know it, the death penalty.
Yeah, that's right. It's one of those issues that really makes you think about justice and, well, morality, really. Like, what does it even mean for a society to punish its worst offenders?
So let's unpack that. When we say capital punishment, what are we actually talking about here?
At its core, capital punishment is when a government, puts someone to death as punishment for a crime.
And in the U.S., it's not like there's one law that covers the whole country on this, right?
No, you're absolutely right. It's pretty complicated, actually. Each state in the U.S. actually gets to decide if it even wants to allow capital punishment, and even then, they get to decide which crimes, are eligible for it. So it ends up being this patchwork of laws all across the country.
Okay, so how many states are we even talking about that still have the death penalty on the table?
As of right now, 32 states still have it in their laws. But here's the thing. More than half of them, they don't even use it. The states that do use it, though, they're mostly in the South, especially Texas.
Texas. Why Texas, out of curiosity?
That's a big question. Lots of history and cultural stuff all tangled up in that one. But you're right, it's Texas. They've actually executed over 450 people since 1976, more than any other state.
Wow, 450. That's a lot. I mean, it's a lot of responsibility for a state to take on.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the weight of that decision, doesn't it? And it's not even just about which states have it or don't. The ways they actually carry out the death penalty, the methods they use, those are different too.
Right, right. So lethal injection is the most common now, isn't it?
It is these days, but some states are still using older methods like the electric chair, even the gas chamber in some places.
Man, those older methods, they always make me think about how much our idea of what counts as cruel and unusual punishment, like from the Eighth Amendment, how much that's changed over time. It's kind of wild to think that stuff is still around, still being used, at least somewhere in the U.S. But I guess that all circles back to what you said before about this topic really getting people fired up.
It's true. The death penalty is one of those things that really gets down to people's core beliefs about justice, morality, the role of the government, you name it.
So let's get into those arguments a bit. What are the main points people bring up on, both sides of this whole issue?
Well, if we're going to dive into those arguments, let's start with why some people support capital punishment, the death penalty. One of the biggest arguments you hear is about retribution, that whole eye for an eye kind of thing.
Yeah, like if someone takes a life, they deserve to have their life taken.
Right. People who support the death penalty often say that for certain really terrible crimes, taking a life for a life is the only way to really have justice. They say it brings a sense of closure, a way for society to be like, hey, this is wrong and we're not tolerating it, especially for the families of victims,
Yeah, you can definitely understand that need for justice, for sure. So is the idea that it might prevent future crime also part of that?
Absolutely. That's the deterrence argument. The thinking there is if someone knows they might get the death penalty, they'll think twice, maybe not commit the crime at all.
I see. So it's about stopping those awful crimes from ever happening.
That's the idea. But, and this is where it gets tricky, there's a ton of debate about whether the death penalty even works that way. Like, does it actually deter crime? Because get this, some studies actually show that states that don't have the death penalty, they actually have lower murder rates than states that do.
Hold on, really? That seems kind of backwards. I mean, if the point is to stop crime and it's not even doing that, why even have it? What are the other arguments people make for keeping it around then?
Well, even if it doesn't stop other people from committing crimes, some argue that at least it makes sure that person, the one who was convicted, can't ever hurt anyone ever again. They say it's the only way to guarantee public safety, in those most extreme cases.
I can see how that logic tracks. But what about the flip side? What about the arguments against capital punishment? What do people say about that?
One of the biggest ones that comes up is, well, what if you execute an innocent person? The justice system, it's not perfect, right? And the death penalty is one thing you can't take back.
No, once it's done, that's it. You can't undo it.
Exactly. And the sad thing is, it's happened. There have been people, they're sentenced to death, and then later, could be years later, evidence pops up that proves they were innocent all along.
Like with DNA evidence and everything.
Exactly. DNA evidence alone has cleared over 120 people who are on death row. So for people who are against the death penalty, that's proof enough, Even one innocent person put to death, that's too many. It's wrong.
It really makes you think about how many people might have been wrongly executed, especially before we had DNA technology.
Yeah.
But are there other concerns besides that? Besides the risk of executing an innocent person.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of people, they think the death penalty is just straight up cruel. Like, it's a cruel and unusual punishment, period. It violates the Eighth Amendment.
Right. That's the one about cruel and unusual punishment.
Exactly. And for them, taking a life, even as punishment, even for something awful, it's morally wrong.
It's like you were saying before about the big moral questions, like, are there lines a society just shouldn't cross, even when it comes to punishment?
It's a huge question. And then you've also got the cost. Capital punishment is crazy expensive.
Really? Is it more expensive than just keeping someone in prison for life?
Oh, yeah, way more. All the legal stuff, the appeals, the trials, it goes on forever. It costs way more than just keeping someone in prison.
So it's not just a moral debate, but like a financial one, too.
Totally. It makes you wonder, where would that money do more good? Could it go to things that might actually prevent crime in the first place? Or, help out the victims' families in a real way?
Man, it's wild how all this stuff connects. Morals, money, the law, it's all tied together. But it feels like there's even more to it when you think about, race and how that plays into all of this.
You're right. You absolutely can't talk about the death penalty in the U.S. without talking about race and how it plays into the justice system, period.
So let's get into that. When we're looking at, capital punishment, the death penalty, and we factor in race, what are we actually seeing?
What we see is, well, it's a really troubling pattern. It's about racial disparity. When you really look at who's on death row, a disproportionate number of those people are Black.
Okay, but how big of a difference are we talking, really?
It's a big one. Think about this. Black Americans, they're about 14% of the population in the U.S., right? But on death row, they make up 42% of death row inmates.
That's more than double. How do you even begin to explain that?
Well, this is where a lot of the criticism of the death penalty comes in. People point to this disparity, these numbers, and they say it's evidence of systemic racism, right? In the justice system itself, they talk about things like implicit bias, where, people have these unconscious prejudices that can affect their decisions without them even realizing it. And then there's the whole issue of, socioeconomic disparities. People of color are more likely to be at a disadvantage economically, which means they might not have access to the same kind of lawyers, the same legal resources as wealthier defendants. And you can't forget about the history, right? The U.S. has this long, painful history of racial discrimination in the justice system. And that has effects, it echoes even today.
It's like, it makes you question the whole idea of everyone being treated equally under the law, There's just so much to think about there.
It's a lot to unpack, for sure. And it raises this really, really uncomfortable question. Is it possible that a Black defendant, just because they're Black, is more likely to get a death sentence than a white defendant, even for the same crime?
It's a tough question. It really makes you think about how complicated justice is, here in America.
Yeah.
So with all these angles, the moral questions, the legal arguments, the money part of it, and now race, what's the situation now? Is there any movement to just, get rid of the death penalty in the U.S.?
It's hard to say what the future holds, really. On the one hand, more and more people are concerned about the ethics of capital punishment. They're worried about making a mistake, about executing an innocent person, which you can't undo. But at the same time, public opinion in the U.S. is still pretty split on this.
Oh, really? Even with everything we've been talking about?
Yeah, it's true. You look at the polls, and most Americans still say they support the death penalty, especially for crimes like murder.
It makes you wonder, what's keeping that support so strong?
It's complex. For some people, it comes down to this deep-seated belief, this is the only punishment that fits certain crimes. It's the only way to make things right, to balance the scales. Others, they see it as something we need for safety. It's a tool, and it keeps people in line, maybe stops others from committing crimes. And then there's the emotional side of it. For the families of victims, the death penalty, it might feel like the only way to get closure, like justice was served.
So we're not just talking about facts and figures here. We're talking about people's deeply held beliefs, their feelings.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole debate so challenging. It's not going away anytime soon. It's about more than just laws and punishments. It gets at our values, our beliefs about life, death, what it means to really have justice. Those are big questions.
It's a lot to think about, that's for sure. This whole conversation has been, really eye-opening, to say the least.
Yeah, same here. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that, we can't forget about the human side of all of this. These aren't just abstract ideas, legal terms. We're talking about real people's lives, the victims of these crimes, and then the people facing the death penalty.
It's easy to lose sight of that when you get caught up in the arguments, the statistics, all of that.
Yeah.
But you're right, in the end, it's about human lives.
It is. And that's why we have to keep talking about it. These are hard questions, but we've got to grapple with them. That's how we learn, how we grow as people, as a society.
I couldn't agree more. So for our listeners, the people tuning in who are just starting to learn about all this, what would you tell them? Where do they go from here?
I'd say be curious. Read everything you can find. There are articles, books, documentaries. Talk to people who see things differently than you do. Don't be afraid to really examine what you think, why you think it. The more we all know, the better we'll be at having these conversations and maybe, just maybe, moving towards a better future.
A future that's more fair, more just for everyone.
Well said. Thank you so much for walking us through all of this. It's such a complex, tough topic.
Happy to do it. It's a conversation worth having.
Absolutely. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.